Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. I'm Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and I write the spoiler alerts column for the Washington Post. I am also the author, as it turns out, of The Toddler in Chief, what Donald Trump teaches us about the modern presidency, which officially came out, I believe, last week.
And I am Stephen Teles. I'm a professor of political science at the Johns Hopkins University and a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. And I am the author. Unfortunately, I do not have a physical book because of the consequences of COVID-19, but I can show you what you would find on Kindle, which is NeverTrump, The Revolt of the Conservative Elites.
And we are here to talk about each other's books, which... I guess we should say, for anyone who's considering writing a nonfiction book, we are living through, in a few ways, our deepest horror, which is the problem when you write a book, of course, is that, particularly if it's an academic press, is that there is a long lag time between when the book is locked down, meaning that the final text is all set, and when the book is actually out. So in my case, I don't know about you, I think the very last thing I could change was on December 15th. And even then I could change very little because I was only dealing with the page proofs. When was your lockdown?
Yeah, so ours was right around then. And so I just mentioned that I wrote the book with Rob Saldine at University of Montana. So, and now in some ways, thankfully, we basically finished it in the fall. So Rob and I met in Denver sometime in October or November to go sort of page by page through the manuscript. But it basically is January, December was the sort of last small changes. So
right, exactly. And so it's like concrete drawing. I mean, when it's still liquid, you can obviously manipulate it a lot. But by the time you're able to make the last changes, you can't do that much. And so the real problem, of course, is that you then have you're in this sort of, twilight period of extreme vulnerability where events will happen and you can't do anything about it. And at least in my case, in the interregnum between when the book got locked down and now, we've had an impeachment trial, impeachment vote, impeachment trial, refusal to convict, and of course the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, and so, of course, the advantage of that is that we can say that everything we said before in our books was completely vindicated by subsequent events. And I did, in fact, write an article along with Rob a couple of weeks ago called "These Conservatives Knew Trump Would Be a Disaster in a Crisis," where we did, in fact, say, drawing on quotes from the book, that a lot of what the Trump skeptical Republicans were saying about Trump was in fact being shown to be true by subsequent events. So,
and I have what I wrote on page 203, I'm in a giddy mood because this morning, as we were recording this, reviews of the book dropped in both the New York Times and the Washington Post. They were favorable, and both of them quoted this line from the conclusion of the book, which said, "Based on Trump's behavior as cataloged in this book, the idea of Trump coping with a true crisis, a terrorist attack, a global pandemic, a great power clash with China, is truly frightening."
So, yeah. So we, again, this is probably not the appropriate time for a victory dance for either one of us. But appropriateness may not be at the very top of our personal virtue list. So, and I should also say, I found Dan's book inspiring because I do, in fact, have a 4-year-old. And my wife has often encouraged me to read books on child development that I didn't read probably in the detail that I would like to. But I feel like I got some of the cliff notes of that from Dan's book.
So full disclosure, and I don't, it's a funny story, but I actually feel a little guilty about this. When I was doing the research for the book, as Steve knows, each of the substantive chapters, which is divided into different toddler traits, opens with a quote from, hold on, wait, do I have the book here? Yes, I do, but I can't show it without tipping over a pile of other books. The American Academy of Pediatrics Guide to Raising Small Children. And, so I was reading that. I sort of intuitively understood that Trump was behaving like a toddler, but I wanted, quotes from the book from that manual to open each chapter. And my wife, upon seeing me read this, basically responded, "Now you're reading this book?" Because we had 2 children and they are far past the toddler phase. And she, of course, being a good mom, read these, various, many books on child rearing. I was less diligent in that. And as it turns out, yes, I can read these things for research.
Yes. So, and one thing that I actually wanted to start with on your book, and we'll try and weave back and forth, hopefully, between our two books. But again, since we are at least presumably social scientists, although I think both of us would admit that neither of our books are at the very the top of the application of social science methodology that we've written in our lives.
I'm not getting an NSF grant for this book. Yeah, that's a safe statement.
So, but one, again, sort of social science question you might ask is that your book basically makes the claim that that the evidence you have from news articles and everything shows that, in fact, Trump is behaving like a toddler. And the fact that so many of the articles use the same concepts and terms says something about the underlying, object of observation, right? And so I wanted to start out with the possibility that maybe you see so much of the same language across different people because it has become sort of a viral meme of the kind of people who don't like Trump, right? So they're all using the same language, not because they're all observing the same phenomenon, but because they're all observing each other talking about the phenomenon in the same way. So how, just as a social scientist, would you disaggregate those two possible theories?
Well, I mean, the easiest answer I have is that I don't think that's correct, because in order to be, and you could argue, therefore, am I the architect of this very meme, since I've been accumulating this evidence now for 3 years. But the criteria for inclusion in the toddler-in-chief thread and the bulk of the evidence provided in the book does not come from people who are politically opposed to Donald Trump. In order to be included in the toddler thread, and most of the quotes that are contained in the book, they are coming from people who presumably have a political interest in Donald Trump's success. They're coming from White House staffers. They're coming from cabinet officials. They're coming from sub-cabinet officials. They're coming from Trump's kitchen cabinet. They come from GOP members of Congress or GOP staffers on the Hill. And they're coming from international treaty allies of the United States. Now, to be fair, all administrations have their factions. All administrations have their leakers. So, if this was something that emerged every once in a while, I would be willing to accept that. But I think the very fact that this is such a prevalent meme, and it's a prevalent meme primarily coming from Trump's own supporters and employees, suggests that there's something else going on here. This is not just it's possible that they've all come to the same conclusion, but the fact that they've come to the same conclusion, even though they support Trump, I think is even more damning than hearing the descriptions of Trump as a toddler from the likes of Nancy Pelosi or David Brooks.
Right. So let me, again, if I was what I am not, a defender of the president, let me just suggest another line that I might have if I was among the more intelligent and social scientists trained of such a group. I might also say that the kind of people who are leaking this, and these are all based on leaks, most of which are unattributed, would be to say that these are people who are selected for working closely with the president, right, and being in charge of managing him. Right. That is trying, they have a sort of organizational interest in regular management, regular procedure, having things, go off. They are very sensitive to the interests and beliefs of foreign leaders, for example, and how they see the president. And they want their president, in some sense, their own identity is connected to that of the president. And if the president does something embarrassing, that has a very particular sensitivity to them. So could this be that they're heightening this particular response because they're they are, in fact, the nanny, right? And the nanny is going to be particularly sensitive to the acting out of the child in a way that somebody who's more distant from that child or less connected to them would be less sensitive and less likely to have a highly emotional response to that.
So a few possibilities. First, that's a fair argument. I think, again, one of the issues, first of all, is if that's true, then why didn't we see similar kinds of tropes described, from Obama staffers describing Obama or Bush staffers describing Bush, and so forth? I mean, each president has a sort of caricature of them from the outside, and very often those caricatures contain, at least a grain of truth. What is striking about Trump is, first of all, the caricature is of him as a toddler, which is really, you and I are roughly the same age. We've grown up with a variegated number of presidential personalities. This is the first time I've ever heard, a president described in language that you would use to describe a 2-year-old. The other thing is that the fact that this has persisted, despite the incredibly high burn rate of Trump's staff, I find is the most telling. Because, a lot of sort of the media narrative over the last 3 years has been that Trump has purged those who have been deemed disloyal to him. Remember back in 2017, there was a lot of talk of adults in the room, people like, John Kelly or James Mattis or Rex Tillerson. And over time, he has clearly prized loyalty, above all else. And yet what's striking to me is that presumably even with a more loyal, White House staff or loyal cabinet officials, and a more Trumpist party in Congress, you still have this, narrative coming forward. So the last thing I would say is, while you are correct that an awful lot, a very large fraction of the quotes in the book are from sort of anonymous sources, not all of them are. You still have Lindsey Graham saying out loud, the president can be a handful. You have Bob Corker saying, the White House is like an adult daycare center. You have Tucker Carlson acknowledging that the president is likely incapable of actually governing. So this is not just anonymous quotes. It's also, people on the record just venting their frustration at dealing with the president who has a psychology of a 2-year-old.
So let me make one other foray into this same sort of direction, which is you have a large discussion at the beginning of the book of the literature on the modern presidency and the modern White House. And one argument you might make about that is that the modern presidency, not the president, the presidency, is effectively dysfunctional, that it's become too institutionalized. And that institutionalization, the fact that the White House now has an enormous staff of its own that is almost impossible for the president to directly supervise. A very large number of those people, right, you could say are working for the president, but the president doesn't know them. He's never really interacted with them.
Or he mistakes them for like secretaries.
Right. But that presidency is not actually functional. Right. The president, in fact, the thing he brings to our constitutional system should be what Machiavelli called uno solo, which is, that Harvey Mansell has a discussion of this in his book, Taming of the Prince, right? That whereas the whole rest of the system is supposed to be more institutional or collective, this is the part that's supposed to actually be impressed on by a particular personage. And the growth of the White House has gradually eroded that unusual, idiosyncratic element to our system. And so it's not a surprise that a president who wanted to have a more, you might call it Jacksonian kind of individual, disruptive element would find those, tethers that we associate with the modern presidency to be highly constraining. And again, if we assume that some of those are also not just constraining, but arguably dysfunctional, it's not a surprise you would find somebody sort of, really pulling at the reins as a consequence of being embedded in that kind of institution.
So that's an interesting argument. I would say a few things in response. The first is, and this is an argument that I make in the book, is that part of the reason the presidency is now structured like this is, and it's the deeper argument I'm making in the book. Part of it is that, yeah, Trump has the psychology of a toddler, but the second argument is that this is a much bigger problem than it would have been 50 years ago. And the reason for that is that dysfunction in other parts of Washington, namely, polarization in Congress, excessive judicial deference to an unwillingness to intercede in executive legislative contests, the erosion of, bureaucratic autonomy, the erosion of political norms, the erosion of trust in expertise more generally, things that I talked about in the Ideas Industry book, all have caused essentially other political actors to delegate authority to the president. Or in other instances, the president has simply grabbed that authority, knowing that a fractured Congress will not be able to take it back. So I think part of what's going on here is that the reason the presidency as an institution is larger is precisely because the president was viewed as the last adult in the room in Washington, D.C., right up until we elected Donald Trump. The second thing is that I take your point about, you do want to be wary of excessive bureaucratization of the executive office of the president. And indeed, we've seen this to some extent within the Trump White House. Think about Robert O'Brien, who's his fourth national security advisor, trying to streamline the NSC staff. I mean, I believe cutting it by more than a third over the last 6 months. But even there, the problem is that ordinarily any president, if they're going to announce plans or positions or policies, usually wants to do so after having vetted it with a staff and vetting it with an executive branch and sort of gaming out what is the proper way, to do this in terms of responses to the press or responses from political opponents or so on and so forth. That is the exact opposite of how Donald Trump does things. The way Trump does things is that he tweets it out or he says it, impromptu in a press conference, and then the staff is left figuring out, is this an instance in which he really actually wants to do something, or is he just blowing off steam? And I think that's the fundamental difference between him and any other president, because all presidents, get angry. All presidents have these impulses where they want to do something, and good staffers can usually figure out very quickly he's not really serious about that, or let's just slow this down unless, and figure out if he really feels this way a couple hours from now. And in most other presidents, that's fine. In Trump's case, though, it's legitimately unclear at times if he's really serious about something or if he's just bullshitting. And he again gets furious if people think he's bullshitting, but he actually wants to be serious about it. And so he then follows up with another tweet, and they have to reverse engineer the policy. The most terrifying thing for me during this coronavirus outbreak has been reading a story about how the NSC has been operated, where literally Robert O'Brien has been printing out the president's tweets and handing them out to the NSC and the NSC staff as if these are the marching orders.
Right. I mean, I guess, though, still there's an argument to be made that this is a book told from the point of view of the staff, right? If I was thinking about, every book has some place where you think about, whose eyes are you seeing through, right? And this book, I think, to some degree, again, has lots of strengths. I learned a lot from it, but it is my parents both worked for government, so I take the view from behind the eyes of civil servants very seriously. But this is very much told from their point of view. It's told from the point of view of the nanny, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and that is a partial view, especially if you think that you have a president who thought he was supposed to be coming in as a disruptive force, right? He wasn't supposed to be one who was supposed to be maintaining the continuity of how things were going, right? And so if you're trying to think about, doing a counterfactual thought experiment, right, that you were imagining that it was Tom Cotton who was president and not Donald Trump, that is somebody who had a similarly disruptive vision, wouldn't there have been a lot of the same briefing? It wouldn't necessarily use the same meme or the same language, but wouldn't you have seen some of the similar kinds of response by, a person with a longer, time horizon and less impatient and other things? Wouldn't you have seen some of the same things?
No, I don't think you would have. All right, let me put it this way. What you would have seen in those instances probably would have been press coverage more akin to what happened under the Bush administration, when there was also a highly polarized environment, and there were, to be sure, plenty of leakers, but the leakers were more – they would offer more substantive critiques of what Bush was doing, and the sort of revolution in foreign policy, for example, that Bush wanted to propose in terms of neoconservatism. And in some ways, this goes back to something that a colleague of ours, Elizabeth Saunders, has talked about in her work, where she wrote a fantastic international organization piece explaining the difference between presidents who have some degree of experience versus those who don't, and how their subordinates operate in that environment. comparing and contrasting the same people who operated with Bush 41, who knew a great deal about foreign policy, with Bush 43, who knew, very little coming in. And the difference was that the subordinates in the latter instance had more autonomy because they knew they could get away with more, because they also knew that the president didn't know that much. And in this instance, I think it's the same thing where because Trump doesn't actually know anything about governing, even people who want to execute his vision get frustrated with him because he's so inconstant. And those who might disagree with him or might, want to at least do it in a proper way are also frustrated because, and, I talk about this in the book, the president, Trump himself genuinely believes that planning is antithetical to how he's supposed to exercise leadership. Whereas someone like Tom Cotton, for all of the objections I might have to the way he views the world, as you say, Tom Cotton has sufficient amounts of experience such that if he was president trying to execute the same kind of revolution, he would probably be far more adept at being able to detect when someone was potentially disagreeing with him, which would also in and of itself constrain the sort of freelancing by subordinates. I think the other difference, and I talk about this in the chapter, which I like the title called "When Caregivers Give Up," which is that part of the problem that Trump has is that precisely because of his personal qualities and because of reasons that actually you talked about in your book, particularly on the foreign policy side, he was never able to attract the sort of top tier of the sort of GOP policy wonks to begin with. And over time, he's now scraping from the bottom of the barrel. And so he's, it's this dynamic where he wants to do things. The staffers don't know how to please him. The staffers get frustrated. He gets frustrated, and then, more people get fired. I think the saga of Thomas Modly here, the acting Secretary of the Navy who just got fired for his inane handling of the issue on the carrier, the Theodore Roosevelt, is a perfect, is it synecdoche? I can never know how you pronounce that word. Is a perfect example of
that's above my pay grade. Then.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of this because Modly, in a discussion with my colleague David Ignatius, said explicitly he was trying to make sure that Trump didn't intervene. He was trying to stay on the right side of Trump because he recognized his predecessor, who's quoted in the book, got fired for disagreeing with him on military justice questions. But in the process, what he failed to understand was that Trump himself is so inconstant on this stuff, much like a toddler, that he got on the right side and then suddenly discovered that right side was the wrong side.
So I guess I have two other questions I might ask about the book before we talk about the genuinely titanic book, Never Trump. One is, again, I previously accused you of taking the staffer's eye view, which you effectively knocked down. And again, I'm playing a role here, so I'm trying
No, I totally get it. Yeah. Well, I do want to add one small thing, which is it's not just the staffers. I mean, there's a quote from Trump himself here where he says in the very beginning of the book, this was he said it to Michael D'Antonio, who was a biographer of him, where he said, I don't think my psychology has changed much since I was 6. Right. It's a little bit older than a toddler, but not much.
Right. So I guess one question is, a lot of this book did read to me as quite sympathetic to the intelligence community. A lot of what you're saying is, look, we pay all this money for all this intelligence and Trump's ignoring it, and that's too bad. But, I just recently taught Amy Ziegert's book, Spying Blind, the FBI, the CIA, and the Causes of 9/11, which and both went to Stanford. And it's a great book and does not give you a ringing endorsement of the overall competence or quality of our intelligence service or their ability to generate quality strategic intelligence, to coordinate across agencies. So, again, maybe this gets back a little bit to the counterfactual. Is it a surprise that Trump, again, setting aside whatever psychological issues you might think, would immediately be in a confrontational stance with his intelligence service, even setting aside the briefing against him, the leaking,
the Russia business,
all that other stuff, right? The fact that in response to this toddler, right, they've gotten angry too, which we all, do when we see, toddlers who have a problem managing their temper, and we have a problem managing our temper, and we start losing our executive function as well. Isn't there something there that is a little underplayed in your presentation here?
It is fair to point out, and I tried to address this in the chapter on oppositional behavior, where you can argue that that's the toddler trait Trump has that in theory would be the most useful in a position of leadership because it prevents the formation of groupthink, which you can argue was present in, let's say, U.S. intelligence on Iraq, for example, in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, and was perhaps, in an opposite way, not completely aware what was going on in the run-up to 9/11, even though there were a few intel reports. I think the answer to this I would offer is that, there's two sorts of intelligence, right? There's the actual sort of hard facts that you can, be sure of, and then there is the analysis of trying to interpret those facts in terms of what it means. And what's increasingly clear about Trump is that it's not just that he rejects the analysis. There are times where he rejects the facts itself. And, part of the interesting thing here is the degree to which the intel community is desperately trying to figure out at times how to get Trump's attention on certain issues. I think my favorite one was where they built like a small mock-up of the North Korean nuclear facility, based on the satellite intelligence they had. So it's not like these things can be doctored, trying to show him that whatever he thinks about the nuclear program, it's proceeding at pace, and he doesn't want to hear that. Or think about the obvious intel that Saudi Arabia executed, my former Post colleague Jamal Khashoggi, based on and you could tell just from the way that Gina Haspel and other members of the intelligence community and also the people briefed in Congress said that to the extent that the intelligence community could have anything that was airtight, this was airtight. And yet, again, Trump does not want to acknowledge this. So you're right that you want presidents to have advisors at least who are skeptical of consensus, to make sure that assumptions and premises are questioned. But that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is that it's the opposite of that. It's that Trump himself forms a consensus of one, is entirely convinced in the rightness of his views, and literally requires things on the order of a mass pandemic to be persuaded that maybe he's wrong about something. And so you want presidents to have more flexibility of mind, and he doesn't have that.
Yeah, I mean, so again, if I was pushing back again, one thing I would say is
this should be your last pushback, because I want to make sure we talk about your book as well.
All right, well, that's fine. So this I would say, if I was trying to come up with an alternative theory to account for a lot of the evidence you present, one of those might be to say that these are the traits not of a toddler, but of a person who previously ran an enterprise that was basically the creation of himself, right? So this is not like, Rex Tillerson, right? So Rex Tillerson comes into an existing organization at ExxonMobil, and he's the kind of person, right, who runs something that he inherited, right? That's what he's used to, right? So when Rex Tillerson comes into the State Department, he comes in there and says, okay, this is another organization that is not just the creation of me, that I have to move in a certain kind of direction, right? Whereas Trump's real experience had been running an organization called the Trump Organization, right? In which everybody there
it was his brand. His brand was
right? Everybody was actually supposed to be working for him, right? They didn't actually have sources of authority outside of his own authority, right? So that's one difference about the executive branch is people have lots of claims to authority that are not just derivative from him, unless you believe in a really freakish version of the unitary executive theory, right? So how much of this alternatively could we interpret as that, as opposed to the revelation of some, underlying psychological flaw?
Right. So I guess a few things. First is that you're right. I mean, that's a fair question. I think the problem with that is that there have been other presidents who came to office. I mean, in some ways, his immediate predecessor, Barack Obama, his primary experience until that point, he didn't have any management experience. He had been a senator and then a state senator and a law professor. So, you can make the same argument about Obama, and yet he obviously came into the office and governed extremely differently. You're right that in some ways Trump, one of the more fascinating elements that comes through in the book is the degree to which Trump doesn't realize what he can and can't do as president, where like he wants to change all of immigration law through an executive order, and that's not the way it's going to work, or he doesn't realize he can't fire the chairman of the Federal Reserve that he appointed. So there is an element of that, and there's an element of that, I think, in all presidents. All presidents come in without that much in the way of, presidential experience, almost by definition. The difference, though, and what makes Trump unique is that every president before him moved down the learning curve. They quickly realized what the contours of their job demanded and what they had to do. Trump has displayed almost no learning whatsoever on this front, and furthermore, he thinks he's doing a great job. So in some ways, it's not just that he's ignorant; he's proudly ignorant on this. Right. And much like a 2-year-old who I think is delighted at the mess that he has created.
So okay, let's pivot. So now you get to interrogate. Now I have to stand in front of the committee and take the action.
No, so it was fascinating reading your book, your co-authored book, particularly, as someone who, with the ideas industry had written a previous book about the sort of marketplace of ideas. And I think, that given the one of the elements that I said was driving this was sort of rising partisanship and polarization. It was interesting to see. I guess the first question I would have is, without being provocative, I guess, is the notion that you were somewhat critical, I think, or you entertained, particularly on the foreign policy side, the notion that signing those letters, and I should out myself, I was one of the signatories to the March letter, one of my last acts as a Republican, was the belief that, if you did that, you were obviously, sacrificing yourself and therefore not going to be able to actually serve a Trump administration if he won, and that would be bad for the country because Trump would presumably need good advisors. He would need, for the sake of the country, he would need a seasoned base. What I'm wondering, though, is whether the last 3 years have actually proved the NeverTrump faction right on this, which is to say that, Trump did pick some people that are generally universally admired in terms of their abilities, and it's not like they necessarily succeeded under Trump. So I'm somewhat skeptical that the NeverTrump faction would have figured out a way to thrive in this kind of political environment.
So, okay. I mean, so we have 2 chapters in the book that are on foreign policy NeverTrumpers, and a big part of those is we got access to the email chain that for the emails that you signed that was a letter that was put together by Elliot Cohen and Brian McGrath.
Right.
And so we actually got to see the conversation people were having, which I think is a really interesting thing. We rarely see that sort of conversation within a kind of governing establishment of that kind.
Can I ask you a question, by the way, about that? I mean, I assume you got that from Elliot or Brian, but did the other people who signed, I didn't know that. Did the other people who signed the letter, were they? I don't remember being informed by them that you were going to be looking at the emails.
So, well, you can. I don't know whether we discuss that in the book. We can't discuss where the sources or methods
of
the book. But the thing I would say about that is, I do think people had different. This was an environment of profound uncertainty. And I think one thing that's really important that we did try and reconstruct in the book, and maybe we were successful or maybe we weren't, is the degree to which people were not in what they would think of as a recurrent environment, right? Something where they could rationally calculate the consequences of different paths of action. And so in part, right, I think there were some people who anchored their rationality to an assumption that Trump was going to lose, right? And again, if you go back in that period, a lot of people just thought that Trump was going to be a disaster precisely because it was going to bring the Republican Party.
It would lead to a Democratic blowout. Yeah.
Right. It was going to lead to a Democratic blowout. So there were certain people who were along those lines. There were also, I think, a very small number of people, but an actual number of people who this was still in the middle of the primary, who worked for who were still working with other candidates, and they saw the NeverTrump sort of gambit as a way to help their guy, right? Despite Trump,
right.
It wasn't that there were. I mean, not a lot.
What? Go ahead.
I mean, it wasn't a lot, but there were a few people who were definitely like that, and we have them on the record saying that. And then there, but I think most of these people were just genuinely offended by Trump. And this is why the national security people were really the steaming hot core of Never-Trumpism, a lot of them because they had experience in office, right? They'd actually seen presidents, in stressful environments having to make decisions. And when they thought about Trump in that environment, that sort of terrified them. The other part is, and we make this distinction with the lawyers, which I thought was an interesting distinction, right? Lawyers are used to working for clients they don't respect, or that they think are guilty, right? Or that they think are bad people, right? That's how they think of their...
And that's part of the legal code, in fact, that you're supposed to serve those people just as faithfully as you serve the good people.
Yeah, and so we had people on the record basically saying, look, we're lawyers. We're used to, defending clients. We're used to thinking about us in a kind of transactional relationship with them. Whereas national security people really don't think about the commander in chief that way, right? They really do think of moral authority as, in a way, embedded in the office, right? And they think, again, a lot of them people had experience in the military, right? They really are used to looking upward for moral authority, right? They think they're supposed to, and that's where I think that's why these people, even recognizing lots of them really disliked Hillary Clinton, although a lot of their reason for opposing Trump was that they weren't as scared by Hillary Clinton as people who were in other parts of the Republican world. But I do think...
I actually like that part of the book, by the way, where you had people say, I think it was towards the end, where the rejection of the Flight 93 analogy.
Yeah, and again, I mean, the Flight 93 analogy that Michael Anton had, I do think is an interesting example where one of the things we draw on in the book is some really great work by Milan Svolik, who's at Yale, who's looked at, he's done actually behavioral analysis in the United States, Turkey, and Venezuela, looking at and this is at the broader public, but he looks at the sort of trade-off between policy and democratic norms, right? And one of the findings he has is that when, if you imagine a political system in which the parties are polarized at 60 and 40, right? If you had to oppose the candidate of your own party in order to serve democratic norms, you'd be giving up 20 points of ideological or policy space, right? But imagine a world in which it's 90-10, right? If it's 90-10, then in order to serve liberal democratic goals by opposing a potential demagogue of your own party, you got to give up 80 points of policy, right? And I think in a way, the Flight 93 metaphor was a vivid way of making that point, right? That a lot of people genuinely thought that the victory of the victory of Hillary Clinton would be existentially irreversible, right? Yeah. And you can imagine why some people, not in your world, right, but if you really thought that abortion was the most important issue, right?
Right. Or the Supreme Court,
religious liberty. If you really thought that your basic religious institutions were under threat from a Democratic administration, you could imagine it was like Flight 93. And that's where I was trying to be sympathetic to the people who didn't make the decisions and NeverTrumpers did.
I mean, one of the interesting things is going to be that I think many people now view this 2020 election as a Flight 93 election, but those people are not the Trump people. They're everyone else. And it'll be interesting to see whether you see that analogy deployed in the opposite. But so, in terms of the social scientist in me, let me put it this way. Political scientists, we are normally used to focusing on variables that matter. Right. Variables that if you change the value of the independent variable, there is a change in the value of the dependent variable. But in some ways, your book is a rather odd one because what you're doing is focusing on an independent variable that in the end did not affect the outcome. Or one could argue paradoxically, created the outcome, although I think that's a little bit absurd. So what I do want to ask you, I guess I want to ask you two questions. The first is, why should we care about this then if it turns out that all of these people wound up not having any much in the way of impact? Although the second question, which might help you in the first, is there a counterfactual where if these sorts of movements had mobilized, let's say, in the fall of 2015 rather than in the spring of 2016, would you have had a party decides kind of moment rather than what actually played out. In other words, is it not that the intellectuals were wrong, it's that they were disorganized and too late coming to the party?
Yeah, I do think that there's a good argument that they came too late. That by the time people realized that this was a genuine threat, that it was too late to do anything about it. Now, right. On the other side, Republicans faced a situation that was so similar to what the Democrats faced this year, right? That you conceivably had a kind of a pileup on the non-Sanders candidates, and the danger was they were all going to split their vote and allow Sanders in. And it is interesting that the Democrats as a party solved that coordination problem, and the Republicans in 2016 didn't. And you do
again solved it remarkably quickly. I mean, in the span of a week, I think maybe.
Right. And so whereas the Republicans, and one question is, even if you believed that in 2016 that Trump was a menace, and he said, all these people have been telling us Trump is a menace and it's a big deal, you still face that collective action problem of figuring out, well, who was the person who was supposed to be the one to take the to take the job, and everybody thought it was them and not the other guy, right? And so and I do think in the Democratic Party, and I almost wrote this up and I really should have, what it turned out is, African Americans really made that decision. They turned out to be the pivotal actor who was able to create a kind of collective action cascade toward Biden. And it turned out there was nobody in the Republican Party who could do that, right? Who could say, this is, of the various people who are all in the multi-car pileup, this is the one who's going to back out and then take it down the road.
Although I do want to bring it back to the intellectual argument, there is another part of this story you could argue, and I'm curious what you would think of this, which is that one of the things that's come through, at least in the last week or so, is that another key actor here was Barack Obama. That, it's not that Obama, and I think Obama would have campaigned for Bernie Sanders if Sanders had gotten the nomination. But I think what got revealed over the last week or two was that, after Biden won South Carolina, Obama talked to Buttigieg and basically said, the moment you decide to withdraw is going to be the most important moment and the moment with the greatest leverage. And you could tell that Buttigieg probably got the message. And also Obama talked a lot to Bernie Sanders, apparently, and sort of gracefully made it, easier for Sanders to exit in such a way that minimized, you can argue, the friction between him and Biden. And what I do wonder is whether one of the differences between the Democrats in 2020 and the Republicans in 2016 is that in 2020, Obama still has the halo of a successful president, who was the first since Eisenhower to get majorities in both elections, generally viewed, as a good, decent individual, who was therefore able to exercise his leadership within the party. Whereas in 2016, the previous president was George W. Bush, and by 2016, he was not viewed in nearly the same way by the party rank and file and the party masses that Democrats view Obama.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you had a sort of double effect in George W. Bush that in large part, and I wrote an earlier piece about this, that, in a large part, the Tea Party, which we often think is a reaction against Obama, was in many ways a reaction against George W. Bush.
Yes.
Right? Think about the strategy of George W. Bush of compassionate conservatism.
It was the opposite of compassionate conservatism.
Right. And so they were already sort of primed to reject that. And so George W. Bush couldn't solve the coordination problem or the collective action problem. And so that's, I think, an important part. One thing I would suggest, so again, one of the questions about this book is, if these guys were such a bunch of losers, why write a book about them? And I do think, it does. On
behalf of the losers, I want to know.
Yeah, so it does. I mean, I do think it says something about the evolution of the American party system, because one argument we have in the book is to get a richer sense of what party is, right? Political scientists are used to modeling parties either as a coalition of high policy demanders, right? People who really want something from government. So that makes external interest groups really central to the party, right? Or they're coalitions of ambitious office seekers. There are people who are running for office and they have to all band together to serve their interests. And one of the arguments we have in the book is, given the nature of the modern state, the fact that there's an enormous government apparatus that has to get filled, we have all these professional services that parties need in order to run for office and to govern, that they do have a large collection of elite, as we call them, elites in the book, who are part of that extended party and exist in part in civil society and other kinds of institutions. And the fact that that part of the party largely rejected Trump is itself a highly consequential act and suggests something about the evolution of the American party system. And longer term, I do think there's an argument which we make in the conclusion that this set of people may have lost now and may come back to some kind of influence in a more factionalized American party system. That is, you can imagine a party system in which that populist majority in the Republican Party has to coexist with a smaller but consequential and therefore pivotal minority faction in the Republican Party. And the Never Trump people could be part of that. They're not going to be the dominant. Somebody has to go and actually organize people, but they could recur in their influence in that kind of role.
So I'm going to have to get going very soon, but I want to close with this last question, which is the deepest critique I can ask of your book, I guess, is that, you certainly focus a lot on the sort of intellectual currents within the Republican Party. When I wrote The Ideas Industry, one of the things I said was that, we talk about how it's, one of the hardest things for intellectuals to do is to speak truth to power. But I would argue that it's even much harder for intellectuals to speak truth to money. And one of the things I kept wondering reading your book was, where was the money? That in many cases, a lot of the sort of different elements of the sort of Trump, Never Trump movement or the anti-Trump intellectuals, one of the effects of this, or one of the things that I think kept the party relatively close to Trump, was that the money in the end decided they'd rather have Trump and his tax cuts and live with the unpleasantness than anything else. And that affected very deeply, how different intellectuals responded to this.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the money mattered, maybe not exactly the way that you're saying. I think, once you get into the actual administration, and then lots of people do say, well, we're going to get a big tax cut out of it, so at least we'll get that. It
does matter in terms of like who funds the Weekly Standard or who funds these think tanks and so forth.
Right. I mean, and that's the point I do think is significant, that there were some very large Republican donors who had supported some of the Never Trump kind of activity during the campaign. But one thing that's really important to remember, and this is a kind of libertarian point, right, is we have an enormous modern state with an enormous amount of discretionary power over the economy. And I do think some of those larger donors, I can't prove it, but this is what some of the people who are involved in this told me from conversations with people, that they were genuinely worried that given the temperament that you described in your book, you see the little tie in there?
Yes, but synergy.
Given that temperament, they were genuinely worried that Trump would use that discretionary power embedded in the presidency to punish his enemies, right? And he very clearly saw the Never Trumpers as an enemy. He keeps referring to them, this kind of a rosebud thing, where he keeps bringing up Never Trumpers, even if they're highly irrelevant now, they do get under his skin, and the people who end up defending him
because they don't respect him, and that's the thing that kills him.
Yeah, I think that's the where a lot of the money was, and I think that's had a consequence, because one thing that hasn't happened in the last few years is some of those billionaires investing in the long-term building of what I would describe as this minority Republican, what I call liberal conservative faction. Right. That is, you haven't really seen the kind of things like the creation of the Democratic Leadership Council, right? Those kinds of things that would allow that faction, especially after Trump is out of office, to try to compete with the majority faction and force them into some kind of deal with them.
Well, I mean, this is the really interesting question. I think we've got to leave it here because I've got to get going. But in some ways, part of the issue is that, you can argue that for the last 50 years, or at least from the 60s to, let's say, 2008, to the extent there was factionalism within the Democratic Party, it was the DLC. It was sort of more moderates trying to take the party and move it to the right. If you take a look at the Republican Party, basically from the Rockefeller Republicans on, there also has been factionalism, but the difference is the factionalism has also tried to move the Republican Party further to the right. And the interesting question to ask, and we should close it on this, is whether there will be whether you will see an emergence of a factionalism on the center trying to drag the party back to a different kind of ideology. Right. And we don't know if that'll happen.
Yeah, and the last just 1 minute on that, I think, that is where the decision-making of actual political agents matters, right? Again, we tend to be structuralists because we're social scientists, but I do think that people make consequential decisions about the marginal use of their resources, and if they put those marginal resources into actually organizing, right, it's not going to happen just magically. It's going to happen because somebody got off their ass and got off their couch and actually organize people for political action.
No, within international relations, there has been a really good nascent, emergent literature on, in fact, the role that individual leaders play. The first images we would refer to it in international relations discourse, that it turns out that individual leaders matter. And, I will close by saying this is my contribution to the genre.
Right. Very good. All right.
That's Steve. Thanks. Good
for
luck
having me
with
on, Dan.
the book.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.